So this HOA president literally kicks down my cabin door right when I'm having a beer with the state's attorney general. She just committed 6 felonies in front of the one person in America who could throw her ass in prison. I'm talking full-on wood splintering, designer heels clicking on broken glass, the whole 9 yards. This woman in her $1,000 blazer, reeking of that aggressive perfume that probably costs more than my truck payment, storms into my grandfather's cabin screaming about violations and jurisdiction like she owns the place. Zero clue who she just barged in on. Zero clue she's live streaming her own arrest warrant to 3,000 followers. 6 months earlier, I thought Karen was just your typical power-drunk neighbor. Turns out she was running a $250,000 embezzlement scheme, and I was about to accidentally burn her entire criminal empire to the ground. What would you do if some HOA psychopath invaded your private property during the most important meeting of your life? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I guarantee half of you have dealt with these neighborhood dictators before. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started. 6 months ago, life was pretty damn good. My name's Marcus Henley, I'm 52, and after 30 years of crawling through muddy trenches installing power grids across 3 counties, I'd finally earned my retirement. The crown jewel? My grandfather's fishing cabin on Clearwater Lake. 2 acres of pure heaven that old Pop bought back in 1963 for $800. Can you believe that? $800 for lakefront property that's now worth more than most people's houses. This wasn't some fancy McMansion, mind you. We're talking hand-hewn logs, a stone fireplace that Pop built with his own calloused hands, and a screened porch that creaked in all the right places. I'd kept it completely off-grid by choice. Solar panels humming quietly on the roof, well water that tasted like childhood memories, and a septic system that actually worked better than most city setups. The morning mist rising off the lake each day reminded me why Pop chose this spot. He used to say the land picks you, not the other way around. Smart man. He also used to say, Marcus, when someone wants your land real bad, find out why, because it's usually worth more than they're telling you. Then she showed up. Delilah Cromwell, though everyone just called her that HOA psycho, rolled into our peaceful lake community like a tornado in designer clothing. 58 years old, fresh from some California subdivision where apparently being neighborhood dictator was a full-time career. She drove this pearl-white Escalade with vanity plates that read Rule 1, I kid you not, and wore her HOA president badge on her blazer like it was a sheriff's star. The woman had one mission in life: transform our rustic lakefront into what she called an upscale resort community. But here's what I didn't know then. 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins to interested buyers within 2 months of her arrival. Funny coincidence, right? Her first act of war came on a Tuesday morning. I'm sitting on Pop's porch, drinking coffee and watching a pair of loons teach their babies to dive, when I hear these sharp clicking sounds on my wooden dock. Designer heels. At 7 a.m., on my private property. 10 minutes later, she's taping this official-looking notice to my screen door. Violation citation. Unsightly dock structure damaging community property values. Fine, $500. Compliance required within 72 hours or daily penalties will accrue. I had to read it twice. My weathered dock, the same one Pop and I had reinforced together when I was 12, was apparently an eyesore threatening the entire neighborhood's real estate market. Being a reasonable guy, I walked over to explain that my property actually predates the HOA by about 40 years. You know what she said to me? Standing there in my own driveway, hands on her hips like she owned the place. Everyone on this lake answers to me, sweetie. Ask the Hendersons how well fighting me worked out for them. The Hendersons. My elderly neighbors who'd mysteriously decided to downsize last month after living here for 23 years. The pieces weren't clicking yet, but something cold settled in my stomach. That's when she started her photography session, circling my cabin like a real estate appraiser, snapping pictures of my solar panels, my vegetable garden, even my grandfather's hand-carved porch railings. The smell of her chemical air freshener wafting from that idling Escalade made me want to gag. By the end of the week, I had 3 more citations. Each one came with escalating fines. Each one made it crystal clear that Delilah Cromwell had declared war on everything my family had built on this land. I figured I was dealing with your typical power-tripping neighbor. Annoying, sure, but manageable. What I didn't know was that I'd just painted a target on my back in a game much bigger and more dangerous than petty HOA politics. Pop's words echoed in my head. Find out why they want your land. I was about to find out why, and it would change everything. Karen didn't waste time escalating to the big guns. 3 days after my compliance deadline passed, because seriously, I wasn't tearing down Pop's dock for some wannabe dictator, a certified letter arrived that made my coffee taste like ash. Cease and desist. Violation of community waterway regulations. The letterhead read Blackstone, Meyer and Associates, one of those fancy law firms where the partners probably charge more per hour than I made in a month. The legal gibberish basically said my dock was illegally extending into community waterway and I owed $3,000 in retroactive violation fees. Plus, they were threatening to slap a lien on my property if I didn't pay up within 10 days. My first instinct was panic. These people had lawyers, I had a toolbox and a bad attitude. But then I remembered something Pop always drummed into me during those long fishing afternoons. Marcus, when someone's trying to legal talk you out of your land, the real truth is always in the county records. Never trust what they tell you, go find the actual papers. So I drove down to the county courthouse, that musty basement where all the important stuff gets buried under decades of bureaucratic dust. The clerk, a sweet lady named Betty who remembered Pop from his fishing tournament days, helped me pull the original property surveys. I'd learned this trick from my union days. Always check the source documents before some suit tries to buffalo you with fancy letterhead. What I found made my blood boil. My grandfather's lot didn't just go to the water's edge, it included 50 feet into the lake. The deed, stamped and official from 1963, was crystal clear. That dock wasn't trespassing on community property. It was sitting smack dab in the middle of my lake. But here's the real kicker. The HOA wasn't established until 1998, 35 years after Pop bought his land. I remembered my old foreman always saying that older properties often have rights that newer developments can't touch. Something about grandfathered exemptions that trump any neighborhood association nonsense. Armed with copies of everything, I marched back to my cabin feeling pretty damn proud of myself. That satisfaction lasted exactly until I tried to leave for groceries and found Karen's Escalade parked sideways across my driveway. Not beside it, not near it, directly blocking it, like she was conducting some kind of one-woman traffic stop. When I knocked on her window, she rolled it down just enough to speak through the gap. "Oh, Marcus, I'm just reviewing the community parking regulations. This might take a while." The mechanical hum of her idling engine mixed with that sickly sweet air freshener created this surreal bubble of passive-aggressive insanity. Here I was, a grown man who'd built half the county's electrical infrastructure, being held hostage in my own driveway by a suburban soccer mom with a power complex. But Karen was just getting warmed up. Within a week, she'd organized something called the Lakeside Beautification Committee, which sounds nice until you realize it was basically a hit squad targeting anyone who didn't fit her country club vision. Suddenly, neighbors who'd waved at me for years were crossing the street to avoid eye contact. Her Facebook posts were masterpieces of passive-aggressive warfare, concerned about eyesore properties affecting all our home values. Some people just don't care about the community, Lakeside strong, property values. The comments section turned into a feeding frenzy. People I'd known for decades were suddenly experts on property law, parroting Karen's talking points like she was some kind of real estate prophet. 3 of my neighbors actually apologized to me privately. Tom and Susan Martinez pulled me aside during my evening walk and confessed that Karen had strongly suggested they complain about my property or face their own citation blitz. Apparently, she'd already targeted old Mr. Peterson for having non-regulation window boxes and threatened the young couple with the baby over their unsightly playground equipment. "She's got something on everyone," Tom whispered, glancing around like Karen might be hiding in the bushes with a camera. "Her husband works up at the state capitol. Connected, you know, political stuff." That hit me like a cold slap. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This woman had reached beyond our little lake community. That night, I found orange spray paint covering my mailbox, bright, aggressive strokes that spelled out "comply or leave." My security camera, solar-powered and hidden behind a pine tree, caught everything, including Karen's license plate as she drove away at 2:30 a.m. When I called the sheriff's office the next morning, guess who showed up? Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew. He took one look at the vandalism report, shrugged, and said, "Probably just kids. You know how they are." The rough texture of that spray paint under my fingers as I tried to scrub it off felt like sandpaper against my soul. Pop used to say, "Sometimes you need bigger guns for a bigger fight." Time to find some bigger guns. Karen's next move came disguised as civic duty. which somehow made it even more infuriating. She'd figured out that direct confrontation wasn't working, so she decided to weaponize the entire county bureaucracy against me. It started with a polite knock on my door from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd actually worked with on several projects over the years. The awkward look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Marcus, I'm real sorry about this, but I got a complaint about unpermitted structures on your property. You know I have to follow up on these things." 3 hours later, Dale had crawled through every inch of my cabin with his clipboard and measuring tape. His conclusion? Everything was not only up to code, but actually exceeded current safety standards. Pop might have been old school, but he'd built things to last. "Whoever filed this complaint," Dale muttered as he packed up his gear, "either doesn't know what they're talking about, or they're just trying to waste everyone's time." The next day brought Environmental Officer Janet Bennett, investigating reports of my septic system contaminating the lake ecosystem. Again, perfectly functioning. Better than most new installations, she admitted. Then Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez showed up to examine my solar panels for hazardous electrical violations. Clean bill of health there too. Each inspection cost me a day of peace and a chunk of my retirement sanity. But more importantly, each false report was creating an official paper trail that made me look like some kind of problem property owner. I remembered something my union rep used to warn us about. Bureaucratic harassment was a classic tactic because it looked legitimate on paper, even when it was pure malicious bullshit. While I was dealing with the inspection parade, Karen was busy playing her media game. She'd managed to get herself interviewed by Channel 7's Community Spotlight segment, positioning herself as this concerned citizen fighting to protect our family-friendly lake environment. The news story was a masterpiece of selective editing. She showed carefully angled photos that made my cabin look like some kind of backwoods shack, talked about dangerous conditions threatening children's safety, and painted herself as a brave advocate standing up against irresponsible property owners. What really got my blood boiling was watching her stand on my dock, the one she claimed was illegally trespassing, while she delivered her concerned citizen performance for the cameras. The crisp sound of my phone buzzing with angry texts from neighbors who'd seen the story felt like machine gun fire. Half the lake community now thought I was some kind of environmental menace. But here's where Karen made her first real mistake. She got greedy. My old buddy Jake Martinez from the electricians union called me up after seeing the news story. "Marcus, that lady's full of shit and everyone knows it. You built half the clean energy infrastructure in this county. Hell, your solar setup is the one I use as an example when I'm training apprentices." Within 2 days, Jake had organized a parade of my former coworkers to drive by and inspect my property. Turns out having 20 master electricians publicly vouch for your work tends to shut down the hazardous installation narrative pretty quick. That's when things started getting interesting. My lawyer buddy Chuck Davis, we'd gone to high school together, stopped by for a beer and mentioned something that made my ears perk up. "You know, Marcus, the Attorney General's office has been investigating HOA corruption cases across the state. Several communities reporting similar harassment patterns to what you're describing." "What kind of patterns?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Elderly homeowners getting hit with frivolous citations, property values artificially driven down, mysterious buyers swooping in with cash offers. Ring any bells?" It rang every damn bell I had. Chuck explained that these schemes usually involved someone with political connections providing cover while the harassment campaign drove out longtime residents. The properties would then get flipped to developers for massive profits. "The AG's office is looking for witnesses," Chuck continued. "People who've documented the harassment and can prove the pattern. Someone like you might be exactly what they need." The mechanical hum of my refrigerator seemed unnaturally loud as that information sank in. Karen wasn't just some power-drunk neighbor. She was potentially part of something much bigger and more systematic. That night, I started a detailed log of every interaction, every citation, every inspection that had mysteriously appeared on my calendar. I also started researching Karen's background more carefully. Turns out her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't just some minor state employee. He was the Democratic Party treasurer, a position that gave him access to development plans, zoning changes, and political favors across multiple counties. The smell of fresh coffee mixing with morning lake air usually calmed me down, but now it just reminded me how much I had to lose. This wasn't about HOA fees anymore. This was about whether I'd be the next victim in someone else's get-rich-quick scheme. Karen's next phase made everything that came before look like a friendly disagreement. She'd apparently decided that bureaucratic harassment wasn't moving fast enough, so she switched to full-scale character assassination. It started with a Facebook post that made my stomach drop. Urgent. Safety concerns about aggressive behavior from lakefront resident. Please keep your children away from the Eastern Shore area. We'll be filing for protective measures. Lakeside safety. Protect our kids. Aggressive behavior. Me. The guy who helped organize the annual kids fishing derby for 15 years running. Within hours, that post had been shared 43 times. The comments section turned into a digital lynch mob of people who'd never even met me, all convinced I was some kind of dangerous lunatic based on Karen's carefully crafted victim narrative. I always thought something was off about that man. Heard he threatened an HOA board member. Thank God we have brave people like Delilah looking out for us. The really sick part? Half these comments came from profiles with generic stock photos, the kind of fake accounts that political operatives use to amplify their messaging. Karen wasn't just spreading lies, she was orchestrating a professional smear campaign. 2 days later, she filed for a restraining order. The petition, which became public record, painted me as an unstable individual making verbal threats against community leaders. Complete fabrication, but it didn't matter. The filing alone became proof that I was dangerous. Judge Patricia Hendricks, who actually knew my family from way back, took one look at Karen's evidence and dismissed the request for lack of credible documentation. But the damage was done. Now there was an official court document with my name and the word threats on it. The emotional toll was starting to get to me. I'd sit on Pop's porch in the evenings, nursing a beer and questioning whether this fight was worth destroying the peaceful retirement I'd worked 30 years to earn. The weight of his leather recliner felt different now, less like comfort, more like the responsibility of carrying on a legacy that someone was systematically trying to erase. But just when I was starting to consider throwing in the towel, something beautiful happened. The community started fighting back. Judge Hendricks wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge William Bill Carter, who used to fish with Pop back in the 70s, showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and some unsolicited legal advice. Marcus, that woman's playing a game your grandfather would have seen right through. She's counting on you feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Don't give her that satisfaction. Bill explained that documented harassment campaigns like this usually indicated larger criminal activity. People don't go to this much trouble over petty neighborhood disputes. There's money involved here, big money. The local VFW Post, where I'd been a member for 20 years, issued a statement calling Karen's accusations baseless attacks on a decorated community member. The Historical Society chimed in, highlighting my cabin's cultural significance as one of the last original structures on the lake. Even the environmental group that monitored lake water quality praised my sustainable living model. It felt like the entire decent part of our community was rallying around me. The bitter taste of stress was finally giving way to something that felt like hope. But Karen wasn't done, not even close. Her next move was diabolical in its simplicity. She somehow convinced the utility company to investigate irregularities in my electrical service. For 3 days, I had no power while they reviewed my solar grid connection for safety violations. Then came the false police reports. Suspicious activity at my cabin during broad daylight. Loud noises suggesting potential domestic disturbance when I was clearly alone. Possible drug activity based on the unusual number of visitors who turned out to be union buddies stopping by to show support. Each call brought sheriff's deputies to my door. Each visit created another incident report. Each report added to the growing file that made me look like a problematic resident. The most infuriating part was that Deputy Chad Cromwell was usually the responding officer. He'd show up, ask a few perfunctory questions, and leave with this smirk that said he knew exactly what his aunt was doing. During one particularly surreal visit, he actually had the balls to say, "You know, Mr. Henley, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property into compliance, all these problems would probably go away." That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was showing other property owners what happened when you didn't bend the knee. The Hendersons, the elderly couple who'd mysteriously decided to sell, probably went through this exact same nightmare. The electronic ping of my phone became a source of anxiety instead of connection. Every notification could be another neighbor turning against me, Another false report. Another twist in Karen's psychological warfare campaign. But it also brought messages of support from people I'd forgotten even knew me. The fight was far from over, but I was finally understanding the rules of the game. The breakthrough came when I was doing the most boring thing imaginable, organizing paperwork for my meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had arranged the whole thing, explaining that they needed detailed documentation for their statewide HOA corruption investigation. I was sitting at Pop's old oak table, surrounded by stacks of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats, when something caught my eye. One of Karen's violation notices had this tiny footer I'd never paid attention to before. Fines payable to Lakeside Estates Community Improvement Fund, account number 847291. Community Improvement Fund. That sounded official enough, but something about it nagged at me. Maybe it was 30 years of reading electrical contracts and spotting the fine print that contractors use to screw over homeowners, but I decided to dig deeper. The county clerk's office had become my second home by this point, so Betty knew exactly what I was looking for when I asked about HOA financial records. She pulled up the public filings and spread them across the counter like she was dealing cards. "Here's the thing, Marcus," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Homeowner associations have to file annual reports just like any other organization. Let me show you what I found." The numbers didn't add up, not even close. Over the past 2 years, the HOA had collected $280,000 in emergency assessments for lake dock repairs that were never completed. Another $150,000 had supposedly gone to professional landscaping services provided by Cromwell Grounds and Maintenance, which, according to state business records, was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. But here's the kicker. The landscaping company had been incorporated exactly 3 weeks after Karen became HOA president. I remembered Pop's advice about following the money trail. When someone creates a business right after getting power, they're usually creating it to funnel money to themselves. The insurance claims were even more blatant. The HOA had filed for storm damage reimbursement 3 times in the past 18 months. Problem was, I'd lived through every storm on this lake, and none of them had caused the kind of damage that would justify $95,000 in insurance payouts. Betty helped me cross-reference the insurance claims with actual weather reports from the National Weather Service. The dates didn't match up. The HOA was claiming storm damage on days when the weather had been perfectly clear. "Marcus," Betty whispered even though we were alone in the records room, "this looks like fraud. Plain and simple fraud." My hands were actually shaking as I photocopied everything. The smooth feel of those document pages felt like holding evidence that could change everything. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was organized theft from the entire lake community. The property management fees were the final piece of the puzzle. The HOA was paying $5,000 monthly to something called Clearwater Property Solutions for administrative services. But when I looked up the business registration, the listed address was a P.O. box in the same postal district where Karen lived. Everything clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Karen's harassment campaign wasn't just about power or personal spite. She was systematically driving down property values to enable a development scheme while simultaneously embezzling from the community fund. The elderly couples who'd sold their cabins hadn't just been harassed into leaving, they'd been forced to sell at below-market prices because Karen's artificial property value concerns had scared off legitimate buyers. Those mysterious cash buyers were probably connected to the same development group that was benefiting from the embezzled funds. I thought about the Hendersons, probably counting their pennies in some cramped apartment, never knowing they'd been robbed twice. Once when they sold their dream home for peanuts, and again through the fees they'd paid into Karen's slush fund. The taste of black coffee had never been so bitter. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Karen had been stealing from everyone, including the neighbors she'd convinced to turn against me. Pop always said that when you find corruption, it's usually bigger than you think. He was right. Karen wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a criminal enterprise. And I was about to hand the evidence to the one person in the state who could shut it down permanently. That night, I transformed Pop's back bedroom into something that looked like a police investigation unit. Maps of the lake property spread across the walls showing original boundaries versus current HOA claims. Timeline charts tracking Karen's harassment campaign alongside suspicious financial transactions. Photos, recordings, and documents organized by potential criminal charges. I felt like one of those TV detectives, except instead of hunting serial killers, I was hunting suburban embezzlers. The Attorney General's office had assigned 2 prosecutors to my case, Sarah Mitchell and David Bennett, who arrived the next morning looking like they meant business. Sarah was this sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who reminded me of the safety inspectors who used to keep us honest on job sites. David was younger, maybe early 30s, but he had this quiet intensity that suggested he'd already sent plenty of white-collar criminals to prison. "Mr. Henley," Sarah said, spreading the financial documents across Pop's dining table, "what you've uncovered here goes way beyond simple HOA harassment. This is systematic fraud that could impact dozens of families." David pulled out a tablet and started connecting dots I hadn't even seen. "We've been investigating similar schemes in 4 other counties. The pattern is always the same. Politically connected individuals use HOA positions to manipulate property values while embezzling community funds." That's when they told me about the FBI involvement. Agent Rebecca Torres from the White Collar Crime Unit had been tracking development fraud across the region. Apparently, my documentation was the missing piece that could tie together multiple ongoing investigations. "The beauty of financial crimes," Agent Torres explained during our video call, "is that everything leaves a paper trail. Your HOA records show classic money laundering, fake invoices, shell companies, insurance fraud. But we need more than just documents. We need witnesses and recorded evidence of ongoing criminal activity." Chuck, my lawyer buddy, had been working behind the scenes too. He'd connected with 17 other lakefront families who'd experienced similar harassment. When we gathered them at the VFW hall, their stories painted a picture that made my blood boil. The Thompsons had paid $8,000 in bogus violation fines before selling their cabin for 30% below market value. The Garcias had been hit with emergency assessments totaling $12,000 for lake improvements that never materialized. Old Mrs. Patterson had been so intimidated by Karen's legal threats that she'd moved in with her daughter in Florida, abandoning the home where she'd lived for 43 years. Every story followed the same playbook: escalating harassment, manufactured violations, pressure to sell. And every family had contributed to that community improvement fund that was really just Karen's personal piggy bank. "Here's what most people don't understand about HOA fraud," explained retired accountant Frank Weber, who'd volunteered to help analyze the financial records. "Homeowner associations are required to file Form 1120 tax returns annually if they meet certain income thresholds. Legitimate organizations file religiously. Corrupt ones usually don't, because honest accounting would expose their theft. Frank had discovered that our HOA hadn't filed proper tax returns in over 2 years, despite collecting hundreds of thousands in fees and assessments. That single fact could trigger federal tax evasion charges on top of everything else. The technical strategy session felt like planning a military operation. We had financial evidence, witness testimony, recorded harassment, and documented fraud. But Agent Torres wanted something bigger. She wanted to catch Karen in the act of actively committing crimes. "The best way to build an airtight case," she explained, "is to create a situation where the suspect's criminal behavior is captured by law enforcement in real time. We need her to incriminate herself on camera." That's when Chuck suggested the perfect setup. "The Attorney General has been looking for an opportunity to announce new HOA reform legislation. What if she held that announcement at Marcus's cabin? It's symbolically perfect, protecting homeowner rights in the exact location where those rights were violated." Sarah's eyes lit up. "And if Karen's pattern holds, she'll absolutely try to disrupt any suspicious activity at Marcus's property. Her need to control the situation will override her common sense." We spent the next week preparing for what Agent Torres called a controlled confrontation scenario. Professional recording equipment hidden throughout my cabin, undercover officers positioned around the lake. Multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated for rapid response. The community coalition had grown too. Local media was alerted to potential breaking news. Social media campaigns were ready to counter any false narratives Karen might try to spin. Support networks were activated for the post-confrontation period. My old union training kicked in. When you're planning a complex job, you prepare for every possible scenario and always have backup systems. We had backup plans for the backup plans. The trap was set. Karen's pattern of behavior was so predictable that we could practically script her next move. All we had to do was wait for her to kick down the door, literally. Karen must have sensed the walls closing in, because her behavior went from calculated harassment to full-blown sabotage. It was like watching a cornered animal lash out in every direction, getting more dangerous as her options disappeared. The first sign was my solar panels mysteriously malfunctioning on a Tuesday morning. I'd wake up to dead batteries and error codes flashing on the inverter display. When my electrician buddy Jake came out to investigate, he found clear evidence of tampering, wire connections loosened just enough to disrupt the system without causing obvious damage. "Marcus, this is professional-level sabotage," Jake said, photographing the evidence with his phone. "Whoever did this knows electrical systems. They wanted to cause problems without leaving obvious fingerprints." But Jake was smarter than Karen gave him credit for. He'd installed a hidden security camera near the electrical panel after the first incident. 2 nights later, we caught her red-handed, creeping around my property at 3 a.m. with a screwdriver and wire cutters. The footage was crystal clear. Karen Cromwell, HOA president and upstanding community member, vandalizing private property under cover of darkness. The acrid smell of her cigarette smoke lingered in the morning air, mixing with the pine scent that usually made me feel peaceful. Next came my boat dock. I'd gone into town for groceries and returned to find my boat drifting halfway across the lake. The heavy-duty chains I'd used to secure it had been cut with bolt cutters. Clean, deliberate cuts that left metal shavings scattered across the dock planks. That boat had been Pop's pride and joy, a 1978 bass boat that still ran like a dream. Finding it bumping against the opposite shore, its hull scratched from the rocks, felt like someone had desecrated his grave. But Karen's biggest mistake was going after my septic system. I'd just passed a county inspection with flying colors, but suddenly my perfectly functioning system started backing up. The smell was horrific, that combination of sewage and chemical additives that made your eyes water from 50 feet away. When the emergency septic service arrived, they found industrial-grade drain cleaner had been poured down my system, killing all the beneficial bacteria and creating a toxic mess. "This is deliberate sabotage," the technician explained, holding up soil samples that showed chemical contamination. "Someone pumped commercial-grade acids into your system. This stuff costs serious money and requires specialized knowledge to use." The repair bill was $3,200. But more importantly, the chemical analysis provided forensic evidence that this wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated destruction requiring insider knowledge of septic systems. While I was dealing with sewage backup, Karen was orchestrating her media blitz. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with posts about my ongoing property violations and deteriorating conditions threatening neighborhood safety. The bots were so obvious it was almost comical. Dozens of profiles with generic names posting identical complaints within minutes of each other. She'd also ramped up the intimidation network. Deputy Chad Cromwell's patrol presence increased dramatically. He'd cruise by my cabin 4 or 5 times per day, always slowing down just enough to make his surveillance obvious. Sometimes he'd sit in my driveway for 20 minutes, running license plates of anyone who visited. The building inspector suddenly found code violations in work that had passed inspection just weeks before. The fire marshal received anonymous tips about fire hazards that didn't exist. Environmental services got reports about illegal dumping in areas of my property they'd already cleared. It was death by 1,000 cuts, designed to exhaust my resources and break my spirit through bureaucratic warfare. But I wasn't the only target anymore. Karen had started going after my supporters too. Jake's electrical contracting license was suddenly under review for safety violations. Bill Carter, the retired judge who'd been advising me, received a formal complaint with the State Bar Association about improper legal counsel to non-clients. The VFW Post found themselves facing a surprise fire safety inspection that threatened to shut down their weekly bingo nights. The Historical Society was hit with zoning complaints about their downtown office space. Karen was systematically attacking anyone who'd shown me support, sending a clear message: "Help Marcus Henley, and you'll become our next target." The psychological pressure was intense. Every morning brought new crises, new emergencies, new bureaucratic nightmares to navigate. The metallic taste of constant stress became as familiar as my morning coffee. But Karen's desperation was also creating opportunities. Each escalation was being documented by law enforcement. Every act of sabotage provided additional criminal evidence. Her network of supporters was starting to distance themselves as her behavior became increasingly unhinged. The Attorney General's office was watching everything, building an airtight case while Karen dug her hole deeper with every vengeful act. Agent Torres called it textbook criminal escalation. When perpetrators feel cornered, they often make increasingly reckless decisions that provide prosecutors with the evidence they need for conviction. Karen was walking straight into our trap, one sabotaged solar panel at a time. Karen's final play was so audacious it almost worked. She'd figured out through her husband's political connections that I wasn't just meeting with some random state official. I was meeting with Attorney General Patricia Williamson herself. And instead of backing down, Karen decided to go nuclear. Her plan was brilliant in its twisted logic. She would position herself as the victim of a political conspiracy, claiming that the state's top prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan reasons. If she could record herself confronting government corruption at my cabin, she could flip the entire narrative and paint herself as a brave whistleblower standing up to abuse of power. The first sign of her new strategy came through social media. She'd reached out to Government Accountability Watch, one of those blogger networks that amplifies stories about bureaucratic overreach. Her pitch was perfect. Small-town HOA president being persecuted by big government because her husband worked for the opposing political party. Local family under attack. State officials use harassment investigation to silence political opposition, was the headline that started circulating 3 days before my scheduled meeting. The story painted me as some kind of deep state operative working with corrupt prosecutors to destroy an innocent family. The comments section was flooded with outrage from people who'd never heard of our lake community, but were absolutely convinced that Karen was being railroaded by partisan prosecutors. She'd tapped into that vein of anti-government sentiment that runs through rural communities, turning herself into a martyr for political persecution. But Karen's masterstroke was the live stream setup. She'd arranged to broadcast her confrontation with the Attorney General live on social media, framing it as citizen journalism exposing government corruption in real time. Her plan was to burst into my cabin during the meeting, record everything, and let her followers spread the footage as proof of official misconduct. What she didn't know was that we were monitoring her communications. Agent Torres had obtained warrants for Karen's phone and social media accounts weeks earlier. We knew about the blogger outreach, the live stream plan, even the talking points she'd prepared for her spontaneous confrontation. "It's actually perfect," Agent Torres explained during our final coordination meeting. "She's going to commit multiple felonies on live video while providing us with a real-time confession of her motives. We couldn't have scripted it better." The irony was delicious. Karen thought she was setting a trap for us, but she was actually walking into the most thoroughly documented arrest in HOA history. Her support network was crumbling too, but she was too obsessed to notice. The other HOA board members had quietly distanced themselves once the financial irregularities became obvious. Her husband was facing his own ethics investigation and couldn't provide political cover anymore. Even Deputy Chad had been reassigned to different patrol areas after Internal Affairs started asking questions about his response to vandalism reports. But Karen was beyond rational thinking at this point. The psychological pressure of keeping her fraud scheme hidden while fighting off multiple investigations had pushed her past the breaking point. She was exhibiting all the classic signs of someone losing control. Paranoid about neighbors spying on her, making increasingly threatening phone calls to anyone who'd supported me, convinced that everyone was part of some vast conspiracy against her. The night before the Attorney General's visit, she made threatening calls to 4 different families, warning them about consequences if they continued collaborating with government harassment. Each call was recorded by law enforcement. Each one provided additional evidence of witness intimidation and criminal conspiracy. I spent that final evening sitting on Pop's porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of loons calling to each other across the water reminded me why this place was worth fighting for. Tomorrow would determine whether I'd be able to enjoy peaceful evenings like this for the rest of my retirement, or whether I'd spend my golden years battling Karen's appeals from federal prison. The cabin felt different that night, not just because of the hidden cameras and recording equipment, but because it had become the center of something much bigger than my personal property dispute. This was about whether small-time criminals with political connections could terrorize entire communities without consequences. I pulled out Pop's worn leather Bible and read the passage he'd underlined about David facing Goliath. He'd written in the margin, "Sometimes the little guy wins because he's fighting for something bigger than himself." The morning would bring Karen's final desperate gambit. She'd storm through that door thinking she was about to destroy her enemies, never realizing she was about to destroy herself. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. Law enforcement was in position. All we had to do was wait for Karen to provide the grand finale to her own criminal career. The taste of anticipation mixed with morning coffee had never been so sweet. Attorney General Patricia Williamson was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of some intimidating political figure, She was this down-to-earth woman in her 50s who reminded me of my old high school principal, tough but fair, with eyes that missed nothing. She'd arrived at my cabin at exactly 9 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and a briefcase full of evidence that would change everything. "Mr. Henley," she said, settling into Pop's old recliner like she belonged there, "your documentation has helped us build cases against HOA corruption rings in 6 counties. What you've uncovered here isn't just local fraud. It's part of a statewide pattern of organized theft." We were deep in discussion about the criminal charges when we heard it. The distinctive roar of Karen's Escalade pulling into my driveway way too fast, gravel spraying everywhere like she was conducting some kind of high-speed chase. Car doors slammed, multiple voices shouting instructions about camera angles and audio levels. Karen had brought her entire social media production crew for what she thought would be her moment of triumph. "Here we go," Agent Torres whispered into her earpiece from her hidden position behind my woodshed. Attorney General Williamson didn't even flinch. She just calmly continued taking notes about the financial evidence while Karen's voice got louder outside, working herself up into righteous fury for her live stream audience. "This is it, folks," Karen's voice carried clearly through my windows. "We're about to expose the corruption that's been targeting our family. The state's attorney general is illegally meeting with our harasser, probably planning more government persecution." The sound of her designer heels clicking aggressively across my wooden porch was like a countdown timer to disaster. For her disaster, not mine. Crash! The door exploded inward like she'd used a battering ram instead of her foot. Wood splintered everywhere. The Attorney General's coffee mug hit the floor with a ceramic crash that punctuated the moment perfectly. Karen stormed into my living room with her phone held high, live streaming everything, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just committed criminal trespass, breaking and entering, and assault in front of the state's chief prosecutor. "I demand to know why the Attorney General is secretly meeting with this man," she screamed, waving her phone around like it was some kind of weapon. "This is government harassment, political persecution. I have rights." The look on her face when Attorney General Williamson calmly stood up and displayed her official identification was absolutely priceless. Karen's live stream captured the exact moment when her brain processed what had just happened. Total, frozen terror. "Mrs. Cromwell," the Attorney General said in that calm, professional tone that probably made hardened criminals wet themselves, "I am Patricia Williamson, Attorney General of this state. You have just committed multiple felonies in my presence, and your entire criminal performance is being recorded by both my office and your own social media broadcast." Karen's phone was still live streaming. Her followers were watching in real time as their heroic whistleblower turned into a babbling, incoherent mess. The comments section exploded with confusion and disbelief as people realized they'd been supporting a criminal who'd just self-destructed on camera. This is my community. I have jurisdiction here," Karen stammered, still somehow thinking her HOA badge gave her authority over state prosecutors. That's when FBI agent Torres stepped through my still-open doorway, flanked by 2 other federal agents. "Mrs. Cromwell, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment. And thanks to your live stream, we have your confession broadcast to about 3,000 witnesses." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through my cabin like the closing of a book. Karen's phone clattered to the floor, still streaming her arrest to an audience that had shrunk from outraged supporters to horrified voyeurs watching a public meltdown. "Karen," I said, standing up from Pop's couch with a satisfied smile, "meet the state's Attorney General. She's been wanting to discuss your bookkeeping methods." The neighbors who'd been drawn by the commotion stood on my porch watching in stunned silence as the woman who'd terrorized our community for months was read her Miranda rights in my living room. Mrs. Patterson, who'd driven down from her daughter's place specifically for this moment, had tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived just in time for the perp walk. Karen stumbling in handcuffs past the same dock she'd tried to have demolished, past the same solar panels she'd claimed were hazardous, past the same cabin she'd called an eyesore. The pearl-white Escalade with its Rule 1 vanity plates was towed away as evidence in the fraud case. The live stream ended with Karen's voice echoing across the lake. "This isn't over. My husband will fix this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Actually, Karen, we knew exactly who we were dealing with. A criminal, and criminals go to prison. Watching Karen get sentenced 3 months later felt like Christmas morning. Federal Judge Michael Harrison didn't just throw the book at her. He launched the entire law library. 3 years in federal prison, $340,000 in restitution to defrauded homeowners, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the United States. Her husband Robert wasn't far behind. The ethics investigation revealed he'd been using his position as Democratic Party treasurer to provide insider information about zoning changes and development plans. He resigned in disgrace and got 18 months for conspiracy and abuse of office. The HOA itself was dissolved faster than sugar in hot coffee. In its place, we formed the Clearwater Lake Volunteer Association. Emphasis on volunteer. No mandatory fees, no citation authority, no power-drunk presidents. Just neighbors working together to keep our little slice of paradise beautiful. My role in exposing the corruption scheme earned me something I never expected. Whistleblower compensation from the recovered fraud funds. Turns out, when you help the feds recover hundreds of thousands in stolen money, they're pretty generous with the rewards. That check for $45,000 felt like vindication for every sleepless night Karen had caused me. But the real victory was watching justice ripple outward. Attorney General Williamson used our case as the foundation for new state legislation that I still can't believe has my name on it. The Henley Act requires all HOAs to undergo annual independent financial audits and creates criminal penalties for harassment-based property manipulation schemes. 3 other counties used our evidence to prosecute similar fraud rings. Turns out, Karen's operation was part of a much larger network of politically connected criminals systematically robbing homeowners across rural communities. The FBI's final report identified over 24 related cases spanning 5 states. The families who'd been driven from their homes started coming back too. The Hendersons bought a beautiful new cabin 2 lots down from mine after their old property's fraudulent value concerns were legally voided. Mrs. Patterson moved back from Florida and threw a block party that lasted until sunrise. Property values didn't just recover, they soared. Turns out, when you remove the constant threat of harassment and fraudulent citations, people actually want to live in a peaceful lakefront community. Who would have thought? The transformation went beyond legal victories. Our little lake became a model for sustainable community living. My off-grid cabin, once Karen's target for eyesore citations, now hosts monthly tours for people interested in solar power and environmental stewardship. The State Environmental Agency featured us in their Renewable Energy Showcase program. I established the Pops Legacy Scholarship, using part of my whistleblower compensation. $500 grants for kids entering trade school programs. Pop always believed that working with your hands was the foundation of an honest life. Seemed fitting to help the next generation learn those same values. The annual Clearwater Lake Festival has become a regional attraction, raising money for veterans' housing assistance programs. Last year, we brought in enough to fund 3 tiny home projects for homeless vets. The sweet smell of barbecue and the sound of families laughing together replaced the toxic atmosphere Karen had created. But the best part? The quiet moments. I'm sitting on Pop's porch right now watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and purple. The loons are calling to each other across the water, their voices echoing off the same hills where Pop taught me to fish 60 years ago. My solar panels hum peacefully on the roof, powering a life that's finally my own again. No more certified letters, no more inspection visits, no more designer heels clicking across my dock at dawn. Just the gentle lap of waves against weathered wood and the knowledge that sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and righteous enough, David really can beat Goliath. The documentary crew from Netflix finished filming here last month. HOA Hell: How One Man Took Down a Criminal Empire premieres next spring. They paid me enough to add a guest cabin where other harassment victims can stay while fighting their own battles. Because Karen wasn't unique. There are power-drunk HOA dictators in communities across America, terrorizing elderly homeowners and stealing from community funds. But now there's a roadmap for fighting back. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment sharing your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're not alone in this fight. These stories need to be told. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about everyday people taking down corrupt systems, because there's a lot more where this came from. Next week, I'm telling you about the city council.